my crazy fucking story of my senior year of high school. All right, so I grew up in a small town in the backwoods of Northern California in a real shitty neighborhood that was perfectly situated right between the projects and the trailer park. And I was always daydreaming about opportunities that my welfare-stricken, drama-mongering parents could never give me. I bought my first car when I was 15, and as soon as I had my license, I started road tripping around the country. The summer after my junior year of high school, I drove out to Boston, where I rented the back balcony, yes, balcony, of an apartment in Cambridge where a bunch of Harvard students were staying for the summer. For $50 a month, it was just big enough for my sleeping bag and backpack. And I fell in love with that city. I had sushi and Indian food for the first time. I rode the subway, went to all these concerts and plays, got a fake ID and my first tattoo, fucking loved it. And that summer, I realized two things. One, I was ready to be out on my own, and two, weed on the East Coast was utter shite. Growing up in Humboldt County, I hadn't realized how spoiled I was. Not only was it some of the best weed on the planet, but because of my degenerate hippie father, I never even had to pay for it. And I also found out that rich Harvard kids had no problem paying $100 an eighth, which I happily sold them in order to help fund my summer travels. So before I had to leave to go back for my senior year, I went on this mission to find the childhood home of one of my literary heroes, E. E. Cummings, which was not so easy to do in the days before Google Maps. But I found it, and I was sitting there writing love poems to the big tree in his front yard when a neighbor walked by and said that Cummings had went to one of the oldest high schools in the country, which was just a few blocks away. So I walked over and was just instantly enchanted by this beautiful historic campus, which basically borders Harvard Yard. So I wandered inside and inquired how one might go about enrolling. They handed me a packet that included the district map, instructions for submitting transcripts, and a course catalog, which I flipped through and just drooled over the classes they offered. Things we could never even imagine in my small town high school, like Chinese and playwriting, AP European history, and freaking syllogism, of all things. Nobody knows what that is. It's fucking cool. Yes. So I immediately start having these fantasies about transferring there. But moving across country by myself at 17 seemed impossible. So I went back to California. On the first day of my senior year of high school, I sat in class with this lump in my throat, feeling like I had just regressed backwards in time. I had already moved out and embraced this exciting new life, and here I was back in my shitty old high school where I had already taken all the classes I wanted, and most of my friends had already graduated. So I pulled out the packet to E. Cummings High School, and I saw that their semester didn't start for another 2 weeks. So I started considering all the logistics involved and whether or not I could do it, and I had no idea. But I knew I wanted to so damn much. And I also knew that if I didn't, I would fucking regret it for the rest of my life. That's how it felt. So I made myself stand up and walk out of class and into the office to request an official copy of my transcript. Only they were not very supportive of my plan. My guidance counselor sat me down and said, "Kona, if you do this, you will end up on the streets as a crack whore." stunned by that, the fact that he had used that word. And then I was so pissed. Like, where the fuck does this man get off thinking he knows anything about what I was capable of? Not only was I an honor student, goddammit, but I had been class president. And it wasn't like I didn't care about school. That was the whole reason I wanted to do it, to take those amazing classes and have all the access to the prestige of Harvard. And yeah, it was terrifying, but he didn't hear any of that. All he did was try to scare me with how certain he was that if I did it, I would fuck up my life forever. And of course, it was terrifying. It was the biggest decision I had ever even considered making. But it was also exhilarating. And it really felt like all those opportunities were worth the risk. So I made him give me my transcript. Now, before I left town, I gathered all the weed and mushrooms I could find, knowing that I'd be able to sell it to the Harvard students to live off until I could find a job. But for the record, I did not consider myself a drug dealer. No. I was just selling a little overpriced weed to Harvard students, that's all. And it's not like I had a scale or anything. I literally used this finger system to measure it out. So I packed up and I drove back to Boston. My roommates from the summer invited me to crash at their dorm house, which was the address I gave my high school. And at first I slept on the floors in their rooms until I discovered this barely used common room on the top floor where I spread out and made myself very comfortable. And I also discovered the back entrance into the dining hall where I had access to an unlimited supply of my childhood dream cereal, which we could never get with food stamps. Fucking Lucky Charms, baby. Yes. I got into all the classes I wanted and started sneaking into world-renowned lectures at Harvard. Shakespeare with Marjorie Garber, anthropology and linguistics with Irvin DeBoer. It was incredible. I got a job at the coffee shop across the street, and on days that I wasn't working, I hung around the Harvard primatology lab where I befriended the professor and helped out with behavioral experiments on cotton-top tamarins. I was fucking doing it, getting this phenomenal education, and everything was going swimmingly for about 6 weeks. Until I was sitting in my AP Lit class, ready to talk shit on the latest Jane Austen I was being forced to read, when my teacher handed me a note saying to report to the office. At that moment, terror erupted into my stomach. I had been flying perfectly under the radar until that moment, but now I had been noticed. I was so nervous that instead of going to the office, I just kept walking straight off campus and right over to my favorite hideout at E. Cummings' house, hoping whatever it was would just fall through the cracks and be forgotten. It was not. The next morning, another note came, this time with an escort to walk me to the office. I was trembling with fear when I walked in and saw the old office lady waiting for me. She said, Kona Maris, which was close enough for Boston. I said yes, and she said, there's a problem with your paperwork. The address you gave us is for a Harvard dormitory. So at that time, I thought the only thing that ever mattered was confidence. So I just smiled and said, yep, that's right. And I even invited her to come over later to check out my sweet setup. But she was not having it and demanded to know where my parents were. So I decided to ask her a hypothetical question. I said, well, what happens if a student is homeless? In retrospect, I definitely was, but at the time I didn't see myself that way. I was just using it as a word to try to evoke some sympathy in her. To me, homeless was a dissolute state on the sidewalk, not a cozy couch with all the free cereal I could eat. But it seemed like the right approach, so I said, don't homeless kids have a right to finish high school? And then, in a stroke of pure con artist genius, I looked her dead in the eyes and said, are you trying to stop me from being able to go to college? That made her pause and say, oh, it's not me, dear, it's the law. And I need proof that you're either emancipated or living with a legal guardian, or you cannot attend this school. Realizing she wasn't going to budge, I asked when she needed it by. She said immediately, but I talked her into giving me a couple weeks until the end of the first quarter. I walked outside and all of the fear in the universe crashed down on top of me. I had no idea what I was going to do. Here, I thought I had it all figured out, and this one stupid mistake could mess everything up. Why did I give them that address? Holy fucking shit! This was serious. I could get kicked out of school. And then what? I'd either have to be a high school dropout or crawl back to my guidance counselor and tell him he'd been right. And was he? Was this the first step into becoming a crack whore? And I knew I couldn't emancipate without going back to California, and that was a long legal process that I did not have time for. So I started frantically telling everyone I knew that I was about to get kicked out of school if I didn't find a house and a legal guardian, and I needed to find it fast. So one of my friends at the lab told me that the professor who ran it was about to go to Africa on a research trip for the next few months, and his new grad student, Corey, would be house and dog sitting for him. So I went and talked to Corey and said, well, would you be willing to let me crash there just for a little bit so that I can use the address for my school? He said that he'd be fine with it, but only if I got permission from the professor, and that I better hurry because he was about to leave. So it was like my best and only option, so I walked down to the professor's office, trying to think of how I could possibly convince him to do this. And I walked inside and just started rambling about how much I loved his golden retriever and how I was really hoping I can help Corey out with her while he was gone and take her on walks. But he had already caught wind of my situation. And he said, yeah, I overheard someone say that you've been sleeping on couches at Mather House. Is that right? So I told him yes. And after this long contemplative look at me, he asked me if I would do him a favor and stay at his house while he was gone to help Corey out. Oh, would I? So that was amazing. And a few days later, I moved into this gorgeous house just down the street from my high school, and one of my problems was solved. But there was still the issue of the legal guardian. So I started doing some research, and I discovered that anyone over the age of 18 could take on that role. And Corey, the grad student, and I got along pretty well. So one evening, I made us a lovely dinner, and I asked if he might be willing to pretend to be my legal guardian just for like 5 months until I turned 18, and I promised he wouldn't have to do anything at all, it was just on paper. And Corey shrugged and said, sure, I guess, which was close enough for me. So now I had to figure out how to make it happen. And I had a friend at Harvard who I knew had a shady lawyer father who sometimes helped people get out of tricky legal issues. So I had him set up a phone call. The lawyer told me my best option was a notary public, and he knew just the one. A woman who might be willing to trade her services in exchange for some good Humboldt bud and mushrooms. And that he would call her and get back to me and let me know if it was a go. So a couple very stressful days later, I get the call that it's all set up, but only if I could show up to her house in New Hampshire that Sunday night. It was a long drive across state lines, and I had to beg Corey to come with me, but he said yes, and we went. We arrived pretty late at night, and she answered the door with her finger over her lips and ushered us past a living room full of kids watching TV and eating pizza. We followed her up this narrow staircase into a tiny crafting room where she slid over her sewing machine and pulled out an old embossing seal, and then asked to see what I had brought her. So after smelling and squeezing everything, she said, okay. And then she proceeded to let me forge my mother's signature on a document, which she then stamped to officially bestow legal guardianship to my 22-year-old roommate. The next day, I brought my notarized form into the office and held my breath while the office lady looked it over. I just kept thinking, if this doesn't work, I'm so fucked. Please let it work. Please let it work. She looks up and says, well, everything appears to be in order. But to make sure I was really staying at this house because somebody might come by to check on me, I walked out in total disbelief. It was unfathomable that it had worked. But the anxiety didn't go away. Even after Corey and I got our own apartment and I turned 18, I still had this fear that they were going to discover what I had done and kick me out of school. It wasn't until I had the diploma in my hand that I knew I had actually gotten away with it. The diploma from E. Cummings High School that I conned my way into as a homeless, drug-slinging teenager. But at least I never became a crack whore.